this timely and essential discussion on rethinking how to eliminate global poverty. So we're here to discuss an extremely important and urgent issue, the state of poverty and innovations to reduce it. So let me start with the good news. We've made incredible progress over the past 50 to 75 years in reducing poverty around the world. In the 90s, there were 1.9 billion people living in extreme poverty. By 2015, it was 735 million, still too much. But now for the bad news. Global progress in poverty reduction has slowed down in recent years and started going to reverse with the onset of the COVID-19. And think about the just challenges to the global food systems with the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So just under 10% of the global population, almost 700 million people, live in extreme poverty, below the $2 a day threshold. The World Bank says we're seeing the worst setback in 25 years. But here's the thing. There are many solutions to address poverty, not from the West, but from the global South. From Brazil to Africa to Bangladesh, some of the most impressive innovations are emerging from those societies with exciting forms of South-South and triangular cooperation, giving new life and meaning to development. But let's be clear, we're facing a major global crisis of poverty. As global economic growth falls, we can expect declines in investment, remittances, skills, education, and health of young people and the newly unemployed. So multiple crises are reducing incomes and welfare of people who are already extremely poor, and tens of millions are falling back into poverty. So what does this mean when it comes to solutions? So as our amazing panelists will explain, on the one hand, we'll need to design safety nets, better safety nets, and rebuild jobs and human capital, especially for the most vulnerable. On the other hand, we need to invest in more coordination and cooperation, especially across the global South. So no country can act alone to manage, much less prevent the kinds of interconnected crises we're now facing. So we need to create incentives for more collaboration between nations and our development banks, private sector, as well as multi-stakeholder cooperation within them, leveraging our social entrepreneurs to solve our poverty challenges. So let's also consider ways to complement traditional development cooperation. So we have a stellar panel today. We can speak to these challenges and, most importantly, the opportunities sourced locally. So as a Brazilian, one thing I've learned is that innovations on issues of poverty and inequality reduction is often most vibrant at the local level. So the challenge is that we need to be able to scale up these solutions. So let's talk about how to do it. So let me just introduce you to these amazing people here. We have Cissa Le, Executive Director of BRAC. We have Tracy Francis, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company. Marcus Troyo, President of the New Development Bank. Kennedy Odede, President, Chief Executive Officer, and co-founder of Shining Hope for Communities, also a Schwab Foundation social innovator. And we have Dr. Molloy Motsepe, co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Motsepe Foundation. So thank you so much. I would start with a question to all of you. And I would just also ask for you to help us spread the message in social media using the hashtag WEF22. So the first thing that comes to our mind is like with this successive and compounded global crisis, we see this existential dilemma at the heart of international cooperation and development system. So as we move towards 2030, how can we rethink or reboost the efforts to eliminate poverty and meet the sustainable development goals? So where do we go from here, given the context, and what needs to improve or change so we don't miss the targets? So I would like to start with Asif, please.
Thank you so much. And as you said, that this is a very interesting time that we are passing through. With world kind of changing of global order, lots of different crises, and during the pandemic, what we have seen that oftentimes, even though poverty has been reduced, people are just hovering around the poverty line, and they're just one shock away from dropping below poverty line, right? So that's why there is also a shift in terms of resources that are being allocated in global development as a whole. So essentially, we have to do more with a lot less resources going forward, because there are crises like climate change adaptation that are coming in. Youth unemployment is a huge crisis, and there are continuous humanitarian crisis. Refugee, I mean, Afghanistan in 2021 is old news now. We are all worried about Ukraine. Everybody has forgotten about Rohingya crisis in 2017, but these are big humanitarian disasters that are happening. So it's a very good time to ask, are we being effective in poverty eradication? Are we being sort of essentially efficient in terms of coming up with solutions? The how part and the scale part is very, very important. So, I mean, I'll start with an example of Bangladesh because that's where I'm from and that's where BRAC evolved, and BRAC went into other countries taking some of the lessons from Bangladesh. When Bangladesh got liberated in 1971, it was the second poorest country of the world. Now in 50 years, Bangladesh is now the 41st largest economy, and by the end of the decade, it's projected to be the 26th largest economy of the world. Now, how did this happen over time? And the poverty rate used to be sort of 72%. It has dropped down to about 10.5% now. Now, it hasn't happened on a whim, right? So, because I think there are a lot of factors in play. I'll talk about 4 things here. First one is that Bangladesh didn't really use the business as usual approach. And essentially, it really worked on with other organizations. The government, the non-state actors really played a big role. You don't see any other places where such large-scale not-profit like Grameen and BRAC comes in, right? So non-social, non-state actors really flourished in Bangladesh with their social innovative models. Now, the second point is around, obviously, investing in people, right? Bangladesh used to be called the bottomless basket case. And one of the curse was this huge population in a small piece of land. But they turned it around into investing in the people. And both looking at the base of the pyramid, not as sort of consumers of products, but really as producers. So building in their capacity, building in their agency, building in their human ability. That's where we invested, and particularly the women became the agent of change. And that made a big, big lasting change. Third one is around, rather than being proposal-driven, and this is true for mostly our not-for-profits, that we were problem-driven. How do we come up with a solution to a problem? So if it's about income generation, or if it's about livelihood generation, what are the things that stops people from producing more or earning more? And then addressing all those issues one at a time. What stops girls from going to schools? And addressing those challenges one at a time until the problem is resolved. So creating that depth is very, very important. And last but not the least, we often look at global development as like 5-year project cycles. We can't do that. I mean, I think that long-term development really requires long time. It's about changing behaviors. It's about changing people's mindsets. It's about creating ecosystem. It's about creating value chain, and that takes time. So essentially, what has flourished in Bangladesh is that these locally led, community-driven solutions, which scaled and which really, really looked at longer-term change. So I'll stop here.
An amazing social technology. You described every single step there. Thank you so much. So Kennedy, would love to hear from you as well.
Oh, thank you so much. So I think we really have to ask ourselves a question that, do we really want to end poverty? That's the first question. Because for me, as I work in the informal settlement, in the slums in Kenya, started in Kibera slum, and then now we are nationally. And what I've seen is that we have to change the way we are doing development. There's a lot of changes for us to really have impact. How can you help someone who don't understand the situation? So the way development is being done, people flying in and thinking that they can save, that can happen. The world is changing, that we have to understand the experience of the leaders who live there. I think if we start doing that, we'll be able to solve a lot of things. And honestly, poverty can be eradicated if we really give the tools to the people who are living in those communities. They have the answer. So right now what I'm doing mostly is to work with the government to come with policies that can really transform these kind of communities. So I think it is really possible if we really kind of unite. But I also have hope. My hope is Africa. Look at that population of the youth. It is growing. So I think if we really, really invest on the African youth, I think we're going to see a lot of success. But if not, we're going to have destruction. You know, when a young person is not well educated, and with this world of technology, social media, and you see how other people live, you join crime. So the world become ungovernable. You know what I mean? So I hope we can really have an impact in societies.
I also hope, and I think you touched in a very important point, like we're missing the human capital we have. We have this youth population in the world, the biggest, largest one. We cannot allow this to happen. So Marcos, big responsibility, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ilona. It's a pleasure to join this panel here. I wanted to start out by highlighting a coincidence, right? Because if for the past 75 years, you look at every single economic miracle that we have witnessed out there, and by economic miracle here, I refer to countries that have been completely rebuilt, or countries that have moved away from very low poverty levels. So Germany, Japan after 1945, China since 1978, South Korea since the early 1980s, Chile, Costa Rica, Bangladesh, which is an extraordinary example, as it's been said here by Saleh, 50 years ago, extreme poverty. Today, the fastest growing country in the fastest growing region of the world. So every single miracle there, right? It doesn't matter whether you're from a different civilizational background or if you have a political system, but there's one thing that's always there, which is openness to trade. There is an intimate connection between having trade as a very important springboard towards your economic success and the elimination of poverty. Of course, depending on how you view it, the sector of the population, trade also creates imbalances and they have to be corrected. But it's an undeniable macro fact that we have to call our attention to. There's this connection between being open to trade and being able to have more instruments to do away with poverty. The second coincidence that I wanted to highlight there is that if it's true on the one hand that the trade has been perhaps the most important instrument in fighting poverty over the past 3 decades, it is also true now that globalization has evolved and it creates other instruments, other flows of resources beyond trade. Forrest and I were talking a little bit before this panel here on the incredible amount of resources, liquidity that you have out there that are available for philanthropy purposes, for social justice purpose, and sometimes you lack the institutionalization of those resources, because one of the bridges that are missing perhaps between, once again, this huge amount of capital that you have out there and the needs is a bridge of trust. So how you institutionalize the trust, implement the trust, measure the trust is a big challenge going forward.
Well, thank you, Marcos. And I think there's something about also like how to get the finance to the local entrepreneurs. And there's always also a mismatch in terms of the needs and let's say the many requirements that sometimes when you're starting you can't meet. So I think there is also a think on how to make available resources to the local people. Yeah. But Precious, you know well what you're talking about. Please, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be on this panel. I wish we were not talking about how global poverty has increased. I wish we were having a different conversation. I'm a medical doctor by training, and I have treated many patients, particularly young children, who suffer illnesses of poverty, malnutrition, kwashiorkor, protein energy malnutrition. We shouldn't be seeing things like that, in hospitals. That's not right. So I think the issue of global poverty is a very important one for us to address. You started off by saying how we had made gains in reducing levels of global poverty. And I recall in a meeting once that Bill Gates had said something like that the reason why we were able to bring the levels of poverty so low at that time was because of China. A lot of people in China had moved from rural community out of poverty into cities and were getting better pay. And that's how the world, globally, we were able to count on, having reduced levels of poverty. So if we think about it, if you really want to make the most impact in anything that you're doing, particularly in solving problems, you go to where the most impact will be felt. And I feel that if you look globally at the face of poverty, it is women and children. That is the face of poverty. And if we really want to begin to address issues of poverty, whatever tools we make, if we are more inclusive and make sure that we intentionally target women and children in our efforts, I believe that we will make a huge impact in addressing issues of poverty in the world, whether it's through education. I was at a session yesterday where we mentioned the huge number of young girls that are going to be lost as a result of the pandemic, have fallen out of schools. That's going to, all the issues that are related to young girls being out of school. And it's a generation that we will lose. Whether it's looking at issues around education and fourth industrial revolution technologies, which promise a leapfrog opportunity for us to bring developing countries and economies such as Africa, where I come from, there is hope that we can use 4IR to leapfrog and bring our economies, bring poverty levels down. But if you leave women and children out, which is currently happening, not many women have access to internet technologies on the continent. Again, you are just discriminating against a huge cohort of the population. And lastly, for me, the pandemic has demonstrated how the social economy was just so critical, serving as a safety net for a lot of people in health. You had social entrepreneurs who had absolutely nothing, but making sure that people were healthy in the communities, working in rural communities. Education, a lot of the social entrepreneurs made sure that students who needed access to learning technologies and data to make sure that they stay in school were able to do that. But we have to be careful that we apply these corrective measures and we are more inclusive so that we leave nobody behind.
And it's so true when it mentioned like early childhood education, like what's the difference that investment there makes for the whole of society, and why can't we do it better? So let's listen to the experience, to the evidence, and do the right thing. So Tracy, over to you. Have your sips of water, take your time.
I just want to make it clear I do not have COVID. Gracious, I apologize for mucking around in the middle of your very interesting discussion. I'm hopeful that I'm going to make it through.
Take your time.
As you said when you introduced me, I work at McKinsey. And one of the things that we are investing a lot of energy in right now is kind of rethinking the system, right? So when we think about the types of changes that have been mentioned by all the panelists here, right? When we think about invasion of Ukraine, when we think about post-COVID or COVID, when we think about inflation, when we think about technology and the impact that's going to have on the future of work, and we put together a confluence of factors, what we see is that countries and, of course, institutions really need to start thinking about the system in a way that we can accelerate sustainable and inclusive growth. And the way we think about that is that each of those words has to have an and between them. Right? There has, on the part of institutions over a period of time, private sector institutions, but also some public sector institutions, that there are trade-offs between those words. And what we really believe is it's important to actually work out how you create a system that puts them all together. So if I go bit by bit, right, we actually start off with growth. which is interesting. As you move around the world, right, in some places, growth is a little bit of a dirty word, to be honest. In other places, growth is absolutely, clearly on the agenda. The reason why we think growth is so important is that it's just necessary to finance everything else that has to happen. Right? If you think about sustainability, we recently published a report that talks about the need for $9.2 trillion of investment every single year to get to net zero. Right? $9.2 trillion is an enormous number. Right? When you think about people and inclusion, right? You talked, Ilona, about numbers relating to poverty. When we look at vulnerable populations over the course of COVID, we estimated the vulnerable population to be at 3.7 billion people. That is an enormous number of people. And of course, as we come out of COVID, things improve a bit. But as you also mentioned, then we go into a food security crisis. So we think, growth is really important to fund that as well. Of course, it would be naive not to imagine that there are puts and takes. And what we're trying to think about is how do you resolve those puts and takes? So if you, again, take sustainability, the way sustainability and net zero plays out impacts countries very, very differently. It's one thing if the way you are cooking your food is burning lignite in your home and your move is to coal. It's another thing if you're in a geography where, solar is actually a possibility, right? So thinking about how sustainability doesn't create further inequality around the world, we think is critically important. And thinking about how inequality is also not further manifested, we're thinking a lot about that.
So thank you so much. And it's also like what kind of growth? So the sustainable growth. I know that's not the issue of this panel, but I think it's just like sustainable investment for sustainable growth.
Yes.
And thinking beyond GDP to measure also other things that make the well-being of people and, just the dignity part of it. But before opening to the audience, I would just like to take this opportunity to ask a follow-up question to you. And Asif, I was just thinking, how could we scale up your amazing social technology beyond the many countries that you work with? I know you have a full plate, but do you think it's possible, or there's a context that is very specific to what you're doing?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, you're right, that there is context. I mean, one solution that worked in Bangladesh is not going to work in other places, and we are now working with direct service delivery in 11 countries in Asia and Africa. But we also have now started a technical assistance model called the Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative, which is a global network of people, specialists, who work with big governments and big organizations to kind of work with them about the approach and essentially the graduation model that is very well researched around the world in terms of extreme poverty eradication. What are the elements of that can be taken into government social protection model? Which is very, very important, because I think, as you said, that scaling fast is going to be very, very important. And the more sort of organizations, governments actually pick up on this, the better it is. Because I don't think we need a lot of new innovations to solve these problems. We already have existing models that work. Now, how do we take it to other contexts? And there are different contexts that are happening. That's one point. And the second point is around also for the business and the private sector. Some of our social enterprises that we started, I mentioned a bit on investing in people and linking them to the value chain. Those didn't actually start with the idea that these are going to be big enterprises. The idea was that, can you create producers and through this, out of people living in poverty, and through this process create an income generation opportunity, and then link them to the market that they didn't have access to. So that started with dairy, the lifestyle products, and some of the biggest sort of enterprises in Bangladesh are these social enterprises. So in dairy to, what we say, dairy to milk to silk, we have it covered. And then we have a bank that started as a SME bank. Now that has become one of the most profitable banks in the country. So the point for businesses is that, you can, social good and profit maximization does not have to be mutually exclusive. It can be part of your main business strategy, and you can make significant profit, and at the same time make significant social impact as well. So more enterprises should need to have that social part, as a mainstream business strategy.
Perfect. I want to hear your take on that. But you know, we were just talking before, and there was no cooperation between, for example, BRAC and Latin America. And what you're saying, like the South-South technical assistance and exchange is so vital, right?
Absolutely.
And just going back to Kennedy, you just described, you already set the tone for what I wanted to know, but what works best when you think about informal settings and settlements? What can we do to empower those people? Because you said it has to be locally driven, and I think we all agree. But in your experience, how can we do that better?
Thank you so much, Ilona. Yeah, so let's go back. What is the informal settlement? Which can be a township, some people call it slums, favelas. First of all, it's about climate change, honestly. Like the story of my parents who are living in the rural Kenya, and there's no agricultural product, so they came to the city. Come to the city, no place to go. They end up in a place called Kibera Slum, where I grew up. And then they're from different cultural places, so they met there. So what happened here, the people were really looking for opportunities. Let's start from there. They are refugees on their own country. And most of the time, they have been forgotten, even by the government. Yeah? So the best way to think is, how can we create opportunities? I mean, and I like what you said about starting business in the community. I have seen, right now we have our small, it's called a credit union bank, that just the people just came themselves, like there's issue of finance problem economically. So they're able to set up that up. I've seen people coming up with businesses, you know what I mean? So the idea is that really to understand what is happening on the ground, and then knowing, and then listen, you have to know that they also have the solution. You might have money and PhD, but you never live in that community. So if you have that in your mind, I think you can really have a bigger impact. You know, just believing on the ground, believing on the people living there. So I've seen the work we're doing now, and right now I'm a strong believer that how can we turn those masses into accountability? Because they're the ones who are voting. So I've seen big huge in Kenya now. We organize ourselves. Politicians, ministers, presidents now want their vote, and they have to deliver. So they're able to organize themselves and come up with what they want from the government. And they want to work with any government in power. So I think it's possible if we listen.
And I would agree. And I think we always disregard the wisdom of local people. And they are there surviving and finding solutions every day. And we're not listening. And I can tell you, we are not, and we should. And Tracy, to you, because you have a lot of experience in working in multi-stakeholder partnerships and what we're talking about to achieve sustainable, inclusive growth, we need government, business, and civil society. So just tell us a bit about what have you been doing.
Yeah, so I wanted to give 2 examples of things that we think are important, right? The first one, I want to talk about digital infrastructure. And if you take what happened during COVID, we had approximately 12% of global GDP handed out in fiscal measures, right? And what we did was we looked at where did that money actually get to the hands of the vulnerable people or the vulnerable SMEs, but particularly vulnerable people. And what we find is it's sort of fairly obvious, it's what you'd imagine, but in places where you have a robust digital infrastructure, so that is people have a basic digital identity and that is linked into an infrastructure, that the ability to get those funds out was dramatically better, right? There's various Brazilians here, I'm counting myself as a Brazilian. If you look at Brazil, what happened was we don't have the ability to link basic information about people to the information that is in the central database. And so what happened as a result was a lot of the fiscal surplus actually went, to the wrong place in the case as fraud, right? Whereas you have other emerging markets that did a much better job of being able to link those bits of information together. And so I think this notion of digital infrastructure going forwards and the collaboration that's required by governments and by private sector to make that happen is really important. The second example I wanted to give was actually related to what you were talking about, which was this question of human capital. How did you say it? The milk to silk to... Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I love this, right? When we look at human capital, what we find is that in a person's life, if you take their stream of earnings and you call that human capital, across the world, about 50% of that human capital is generated through experience with an employer. If you then go to jobs where the person has very limited education or no education at all, that number goes up to 80-90%. It's exactly what you were talking about in the start with something simple and move it up. And I think here the argument, and by the way, the single biggest factor for what increases that human capital is the experience that the employer offers to that person. What are the skills that they enable them to operate? So a domestic worker in Brazil may then be noticed for the organizational skills they have. They may then go and work as an assistant to someone. They may then go and work in a company, applying those skills that they've developed. They may progress in the company, right? The company, the employer has the single biggest ability to influence that human capital. And so I think that's just another area when, of course, governments need to invest in education, but the reality is that that's not going to be enough, right? We also have to depend on the private sector to really drive that human capital.
No, absolutely. And just for your first point, connectivity is so key. When you think about the regions of the world that are not connected, so we cannot deliver the services at the speed of the need. So, I think that's something that we have to address because there is a divide there. And I couldn't agree more on skills. And I think we've spoken so much here about how to just prepare also for the future and also to leapfrog, because many of the regions, we don't want them to have the same skills of the past, because that's what you want to sometimes transfer, let's say the past skills.
Yes.
But no, let's look into the future and let's include them in what's coming. I think that's absolutely key. So Marcos, to you again. So how can we boost these partnerships among the United Nations system, like regional banks and international financial institutions, businesses, and like to really, I think to really address those most affected? Because as you're saying, I know you have big projects, big ideas, and I would say very challenging ones. But how could you see the system working also to address issues such as this one that you're talking here?
Well, Ilona, my first experience with the international system or multilateralism, as it's implied in your question, was back in the 90s when I was posted to the United Nations in New York, and now I'm heading a multilateral development bank. And thinking back at my UN experience, sometimes I got frustrated because the system might be slow. Multilateralism, is multi-stakeholder, so it always takes time to build consensus. Some view it as very bureaucratic. But, at the end of the day, you come to the conclusion that all of the alternatives are worse.
You're back to multilateralism.
I'm back to multilateralism. I'm happy about it. And I'm glad that are there. And we are living in an age where there can be multilateralism. For example, the New Development Bank is very focused on infrastructure and sustainable development. Other multilateral institutions have another narrow focus. That's fine. They can coexist. There is an ecosystem of multilateral institutions that can live together. Of course, our focus is directing resources for infrastructure projects in the same way that I mentioned this connection between trade and poverty elimination. There is a very strong connection between infrastructure and growth, and that adds to the point that Tracy was mentioning here. Growth is important. We're not going to go anywhere without growth. And I'm sorry, Bangladesh perhaps is the single most eloquent example of that. So by funding infrastructure projects, the exponential benefits that you get through poverty alleviation are also there to be seen. And I think since the New Development Bank came into existence 7 years ago, we already have 80 projects, $30 billion of approvals. It's making a difference in people's lives across our member countries. But you touched upon something else here that I think not a lot of people talk about, and I think it's crucial. We're stepping into the fourth industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution was about manufacturing.
Yeah.
The fourth industrial revolution is about manufacturing. And people's life expectancy at birth are going up. So you have one set of challenges that is connected to poverty, which is, are you skilling people? Are you educating people enough to say they reach the age of 25? So that is challenge number one. And then challenge number two is, you might have skilled the people for the second or for the third industrial revolution, but when they reach the age of 35, if they're in sectors, for example, that are not going to be at the forefront of what's next in terms of technology, in terms of human capital, in terms of education, very, very early in their lives, they're going to be less, adaptable to these new challenges. And when we face a situation that's going to bring about lots of public budget problems, public security problems, which is what is it that you do with your life in between the ages of 35 to 75 or 80 if you don't have the skills, once again, to build your own living. So that's another major challenge that we have. Professor Schwab, for example, a number of years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, said that talent has become the single most important factor of production. Therefore, we shouldn't call our system capitalism anymore. We should call it talentism. So in this new age of talent, poverty alleviation, poverty elimination, and skilling and reskilling must also be thought of in a new light.
Thank you so much. So on your first point, a spoiler, I want to talk to you more about, because I'm in a UN Secretary General panel on effective multilateralism. So I'll get back to your ideas. But on your second point, I think that's the perfect way just for Dr. Motsepe tell us about the role of education in all of this, because that's, I think, what we're all just trying to see. How do we prepare our young people and the future generations, because they're going to have to be, like the brain has to be into another connectivity that I don't even know that we are able here to understand, the flexibility that they will need to have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So my husband and I started a family foundation back in '93. It's probably one of the largest foundations on the African continent. We're part of the Giving Pledge. And our starting the foundation was because we appreciate the fact that throughout our lives, we were supported by many people to be where we are. Even today, sitting here with this panel, it's honestly because of access to good education that we were able to be successful in life, coming from a country that had racial injustices, South Africa, many years ago. And we still believe in the value of education in providing young people with opportunities. Our foundation's focus has, our mandate is, contributing towards global poverty alleviation, and our focus areas include education amongst many other things. And I'll tell you, we have one young lady who internshiped at McKinsey, thank you very much, recently, and she came from a rural village, had fallen out of school because of pregnancy. We found her, we brought her back into schooling. She went to university, graduated with a BCom degree, and went on to do her master's. She took her family, her mother and her daughter, who now goes to a child health care center. Her mother was diabetic for a long time, untreated, undiagnosed, is now, receiving proper medical care. And she has gone back to her village, her home village. She is like a role model for young girls in that village. Young children in the village look up to her. So for us, that one young girl represents many, many other young people that we need to find, give opportunities to, so that they can then be able to define their future. They can be able to contribute towards, our global growth. They are very critical. And particularly ensuring that they are educated in those sectors of the economy that are absorbing labor, or they can become social entrepreneurs like my brother here. So Girls in STEM is one of our big projects. We really ensure that young girls follow the STEM fields. Social entrepreneurship and education, executive education around social enterprises is very important. We have a partnership with the Schwab Foundation on social entrepreneurs, and many of these social entrepreneurs are doing amazing work, from education itself, which is critical, to saving mothers in rural communities, using drones to deliver blood samples to those rural communities. So for us, education has been very key, as well as supporting the social entrepreneurs. And I wanted to say to you that I know you talk about infrastructure projects. We need to give social entrepreneurs opportunities, have set aside preferential procurement for our social entrepreneurs, because they are in touch with people on the ground, and when we support them, we bring funds within communities that helps to uplift everybody.
Well, thank you for the amazing work you do and for believing in people. So now I want just to get the questions from the audience, because we have this amazing group, so please.
I'm Christine Andresen of Norway. It's one point that I would like to stress that I think is very important, because what we see now is all the crises going on in the world. And in the crisis, we see so many people falling into poverty, and it's really increasing. But on the other hand, we have a lot of people, like one every minute, becoming a billionaire. And that leads to, we need to look into one of what I think is most important things, is the distribution of wealth. And how can we do that? Because it's needed, the money, and we have all the brains and the good people, the organizations everywhere that could help build the systems, but they need a constant stream of money. And my idea, not only mine, but also several others, is to put a tax on all financial transactions, and especially on the crypto, because on the crypto, it is easy to have it done, because it is controlled, the crypto, the whole system, and where also you get hold of all the dirty money, not only on the clean money, which you will have if you just go for financial transactions. Because we need to close the gap between the really wealthy people and all the poor people, because if not, it will lead to disruption.
Would you like to comment on that? Anybody? So any other question, please?
Hello, my name is Rashid. I'm from Ghana. Thank you very much, everyone. I've been sitting here deep in thoughts, and then once you hear something, you think this is really insightful, and another thing hits you, and then it's just,
Good.
I felt like I was always playing catch-up. But the one aspect that didn't come up that I thought I would put to the floor for, not for now, maybe after, we can all keep it in our sort of conscious to think about, is housing. With the issue of housing in the case of Africa, there's really huge potential for this challenge to create an opportunity for job creation, wealth creation, and innovation. And I will just touch on two. I know we don't have the time. One of our resources, and we all heard that today in many sessions and here as well, how the population of the African youth is growing. Roughly about the population of America today will be added to the continent by 2030. As we speak, there's a massive deficit of housing on the continent, and it's not getting better. So my proposal is, if we try to look inwards within Africa and focus on one of these challenges, which is the housing issue, and work on that to see how that can sort of unlock innovation. For example, the use of local materials. Most of the most expensive part of construction in Africa is import of materials. We're still relying on about roughly 60% of our inputs coming from the West. So add that to what we're having now with supply chain, et cetera, see what that will happen. If we're able to sort of get our youth into communities, house them, and then sort of invest in this infrastructure, we would have an ecosystem of young people who think alike, are all-minded, and there's that convergence of taste. They want what is happening everywhere else in the world, and they're seeing it through digitalization and the media. These people would innovate, create jobs in their communities, and probably go back to their real areas and create jobs there. And never to mention the fact that to build, we need the builders, et cetera, and all of this will be local. And that will be a huge source of unlock for wealth generation. That's just if you have any sort of comments on that, I will appreciate it.
Who would like to pick on that candidate to
Okay,
start?
Rashid, yeah.
Thank you.
Let me try to talk about that, Rashid. So if you think of a place like Kenya, Kibera slum is the largest slum in Africa. And the area, there's like almost 1 million people in the area size of Central Park. So I'll go back to the point again. So what happened is that the government and some agencies, I won't say their name, they thought they can solve the problem of housing. So they came in, took one section, they built. They forgot some of the community aspect of it. You know, who is your person who owns the kiosk, who you can go borrow, a woman who sells vegetables. You know, there's this kind of social connection that they didn't thought about that. Guess what happened? It did not work. Why? And that's a bigger problem. There is no housing for the emerging middle class. So they left, they came to those houses. And for people living in the slums, they're like, you know what? You can pay me, I'll keep on living in a slum. You know? You see, so it's a big thing. And look at a place like 1 million people live there. How many, if we build really good housing, we can have a big space for football, for fun, right? So it's a big issue. But right now, the government has been really having a plan, and we're engaging them. Like, listen, the employers have to come from the community. We have to bring the designers, architects, to sit down with the locals. That's when you have the best housing. Yeah. So we are pushing for that in Kenya. Thank you, Rashid.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I just want to take both of the comments in one go. Absolutely, housing is an opportunity, but there are many like this. There are opportunities in this emerging economy where your profit may not come in 5 years, but it will come in 10 years. I mean, that's our example has been shown. But this is where, social entrepreneurs come in, right? And this is where, you need injection of capital. We are hearing a lot about impact investment. But when I talk to these investors, their ROI is, I want to see a 10% ROI within 5 years. That's not patient capital. You need to have a long-term vision on this, right? And because you will need to put in money, you will need to subsidize, you will need to create the market. And there are lots of opportunities for job creation, income generation, and essentially going back to what you were saying about structural inequality, that is absolutely that we need to work on this. But at the same time, it's not going to go away overnight. Taxation is obviously one way to tax the rich, but it's not going to solve the structural inequality. And one of the things that our examples in Bangladesh from BRAC, but we saw that when you try to invest in existing sets of economic activities, the elite capture happens. Usually the top of the society captures the benefit of it. But if you do invest in newer kinds of activities that was not there before, like our friend has mentioned over there, and there are, as Marcos mentioned, that there's new knowledge economy that is emerging, right? So where are those new opportunities that are emerging? Whether it's in sustainable tourism, whether it's in digital economy and others. And if we can build capacity and create the ecosystem, and this is where you need the multilaterals, you need the impact investors, these implementers, social entrepreneurs, all of them needs to come together. But some curation has to happen, essentially, right?
May I jump in, Nila? Yeah, so I just wanted to zoom out to the macro level again and say that if you think about something that the mathematicians say, the so-called rule of 70, imagine a country like Bangladesh. So Bangladesh this year is supposed to grow in between 7 and 8%, right? So if you divide 70 by 7, that's 10. So 10 will be the number of years in which Bangladesh is going to double its income per capita, right? So once again, this very close connection between growth and moving away from poverty. And that might create inequalities. In my opinion, and addressing your question, what is the great equalizer of opportunities? It's infrastructure investment. It's in housing, it's in water, it's in sanitation, and it is, as you were saying, in social infrastructure as well. So once again, let us not lose sight. Of course, there can be, boutique solutions here and there for poverty, but we should never lose out on the big picture. Growth must take place so that we can keep on addressing the challenges of poverty, and one of them, redistributing opportunity by means of infrastructure investment.
Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. Faris Murad, Peak Values. A very small question. You incentivize people when they've got an interest in an issue. Now, I've seen many panels. The rooms are filled. Here, it's half filled. So my question to you is, if we want to fight poverty, how can we incentivize each and every inhabitant of this earth to have interest, hedonic interest, to solve this issue?
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Who would like to?
I mean, if the pandemic has shown that, you're not safe until everybody is safe, right? So I think that what's missing is the urgency amongst everybody, right? So people do not feel that there is enough urgency in solving some of these problems. I see a big disconnect in terms of what's happening on the ground in the majority of the world and what's getting discussed here, right? So there is that, because say climate change, I mean, for example, what we are dealing with in Bangladesh and other parts of the country in Africa is there are serious water crises, there are serious emergencies around disasters that needs immediate and serious migration happening from rural to urban areas. We need solutions, we need scalable solutions that needs to be done. But when I hear about climate discussions here, which is equally important, but which is mostly around mitigation, keeping 1.5 degree below so that, okay, fire is gonna start if we don't have that. But fire has already started, but so where are the focus on that? So because people are far away from that problem, they don't feel the urgency. That's why I think people like Kennedy, Precious, and all of us, we also from the Global South need to bring that out and inject that dose of realism in this discussion. So, I mean, I think and that it needs to be everybody's business. It's not, should be just,
I wanted to build on this because I completely agree with you. And I think you're implicitly onto something, which is the discussion around sustainability is actually inherently linked with the discussion on poverty, right? I mean, if you think about, even if we don't take the fires and the floods, which I completely agree with you with, but even if we focus on the maintain net zero, if you think about where youth populations are, right, Africa, Middle East, if you think about the changes that need to go on in those economies to maintain net zero, it's almost inevitable that increases the vulnerable populations and the poverty in young populations, right? This is a disaster. And so I think what we all have to do, I completely agree with your point, build urgency, build urgency. The reason why we talk about sustainable and inclusive and growth is because you get growth and sustainability without the inclusion, it's not going to work. And I think we have to, we all have to link those concepts together or it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Any other point? No? So a final question, otherwise I'll just go for a final question here. We're just almost on time. So I think I'll just ask you to distill, like looking to the future, just distill the lessons we've learned here. So like how can we do it better and where should we focusing our attention? So if you just final remarks for this distillation of your amazing insights, but in a shorter time so we just keep the messages.
So the metamorphosis of infrastructure. Infrastructure is a great equalizer of opportunities, including in eliminating poverty. Traditional infrastructure and digital infrastructure, because digital infrastructure may be the great exponentiating factor of what you would do in terms of education and health.
Thank you so much. We can go in order. Dr. Price.
Oh, okay. I think a greater emphasis on collaborations and really having these discussions. When WEF started many years ago, I believe one of the big topics was this multi-stakeholder partnership concept. And I think we really need to go back to that. If you think how we managed to find vaccines for the pandemic, is because we came together and tried to work together. And then we become selfish again. We need to collaboration, I think, is the best way for us to move forward.
And women and girls, huh?
Women and girls. Inclusiveness.
Honestly, because that's such an important point. Asif, please.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of start from where I left off on the last question, is that I think, inequality will create greater social incohesion, rather. I mean, and that will create greater instability. We don't need that in this world. So we have enough problems, but we really, that as I was saying, it needs to be really everybody's business, because it is going to affect everybody. If inequality happens, there will be security threats, there will be other future pandemics and other things that is going to affect the sort of so-called developed world as well. So how do we kind of, again, collaborate? I mean, I think everybody has a sort of role to play, and a critical role. This is not about that private sector is bad and this is good and bad. It's really this larger piece. There are fantastic models that are out there which needs to be scaled up. And then there are actors who are out there which needs to play their role and step up with that end goal. And I see that in the newer generation is much more purpose-driven. And businesses are also sort of really waking up to that fact that sustainable planet that we want in the future cannot happen if we change from business as usual. So it's now these kinds of conversations with different actors leading to very tangible actions is very, very important.
Thank you. Tracy?
So I agree with the comments, and I won't repeat any of them. I did want to put a finer point on this question of human capital, the role of institutions in developing, the skills that are not coming through the education system, and the importance that those skills are relevant to the world that we're going to live in, right? If 25% of jobs that exist now are not going to exist 10 years from now, then creating the right type of skills in people who need to exit poverty is so critical.
Thank you so much. And is it the time for the S in ESG also to come more permanent?
Absolutely.
Okay, because this is an important message I've been hearing this, so let's repeat it. So Kennedy, please.
I just want to add on this issue of COVID. COVID has taught us something on inequality that exists. And you are not safe if others are not safe. We are one. So I hope this will help us to really create structures. What happened as I work in the slums, I saw the impact of it. It was really terrible. So I hope this will open people's eye on how the government and private sector, how to bring in the infrastructures, and the systems so that we don't really get into that kind of a situation again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's so true, because we hope not, but we never know when the next two hit. So let's hope not. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for just helping me, thinking this wonderful panel here, and to be continued, to bring more people in the next edition to this discussion. So everyone here should just call your friends for the next Davos in January. Let's do it again. Thank you.